At my son's college graduation, after I handed him the envelope I'd been saving toward for 11 years, he stood at the podium in front of 400 people and thanked everyone in the room, his professors, his roommates, his girlfriend's parents, even the janitor who let him into the library after hours. He never said my name, but when he opened that envelope 2 hours later, his whole world cracked open. Before I get to that, let me tell you who I am. I'm 63 years old. I spent 32 years driving a Cisco food distribution truck out of a depot in Columbus, Ohio. Early mornings, late nights, holidays, all of it. My knees tell that story better than I do. My name is Roy Callahan, and the woman I loved, my wife Patty, died of ovarian cancer 6 years ago this past March. After she went, it was just me and my son, Eli. Eli is 24 now. He got into Ohio State on a partial scholarship, engineering program, which made me so proud I cried in the parking lot after the acceptance letter came. The scholarship covered about half. I covered the rest. Not with savings I had sitting around either. I picked up weekend shifts at a Home Depot warehouse. I refinanced the house. I did what fathers do. I didn't tell Eli any of that, because Patty always said, the right kind of giving doesn't come with a receipt attached. The trouble started, I think, when Eli met Garrison's family. Garrison Webb, that's his girlfriend's father, owns 3 car dealerships in the Dublin area and a lake house up near Marblehead. Nice man, I suppose, in the way that people with money can afford to seem nice. They met Eli at a parents' weekend sophomore year, and after that, something in my son started shifting. Not all at once. More like a slow lean, the way a fence post goes when the ground softens. By his junior year, Eli had started spending Thanksgiving at the Webb family cabin. It's just easier, Dad. You know how traffic gets. I told him sure, no problem, and I ate leftover chicken at my kitchen table watching football alone. By senior year, he'd mention Garrison the way some kids mention a coach who changed their life. Garrison says the real money is in commercial real estate. Garrison introduced me to his financial advisor. Garrison took us to a Cubs game in a box suite. I tried not to read into it, tried to be glad my son had found people who could expand his world. But there's a particular silence that opens up between a father and a son when the son starts being embarrassed, and I knew that silence well by the time graduation came around. The ceremony was at Ohio Stadium. May sunny, the kind of day Patty would have dressed up for. I'd had my good blazer dry cleaned, bought new shoes, drove down the night before and stayed at a Hampton Inn off Ackerman Road so I wouldn't have to rush the morning of. Eli had texted me the seat assignment. Section 14C, row 22. I found it without any trouble, settled in between a grandmother from Dayton and a couple from Cincinnati, whose daughter was getting her nursing degree. We talked before things started. Normal stuff. That easy warmth that comes from strangers sharing a proud moment. The processional started and I spotted Eli in the 3rd row of the engineering cohort. Tall, dark-haired like Patty, that focused expression he's had since he was 8 years old. My chest felt full in a way I can't describe better than that. The speeches ran long. The dean spoke. A faculty member spoke. Then they called the student speaker, and I saw Eli walk to the podium, and I understood he'd been selected to represent his graduating class. He hadn't told me. I found that out the same way everyone else did, sitting in row 22. He was good. He was genuinely good. Poised, specific, funny in the right places. He talked about the engineering program, about problem solving, about the importance of the people who shape you. He thanked his professors by name. He thanked his study group. He thanked the Webbs, said it right into the microphone, Garrison and Diane Webb, who showed him what it looked like to build something that lasts. He thanked his girlfriend. He thanked the university. He never said Roy Callahan. He never said Dad. The grandmother from Dayton glanced at me sideways. I kept my eyes on the stage. My hands were folded in my lap, and I made sure they stayed still. After the ceremony, families poured onto the field. I found Eli near the south tunnel, cap and gown still on, Garrison's arm around his shoulder. They were all laughing at something. His girlfriend, whose name is Tessa, spotted me first and waved me over with genuine warmth. She's a good person, Tessa. I've always liked her. Dad. Eli pulled me into a hug, quick and firm. You made it. Of course I made it. We took pictures. The Webbs included me in a few, which was kind of them. Garrison shook my hand and said he'd heard a lot about me, which, given everything, felt like a thing people say. We moved to a restaurant Garrison had reserved, a private room at a steakhouse near campus, the kind of place where the menus have no prices. 18 people. I sat at the far end of the table near Tessa's aunt, who talked to me pleasantly about her garden in Westerville. I had the envelope in my inside jacket pocket the whole time. Plain white business envelope, sealed. Inside was a card I'd written out the night before at the Hampton Inn, and a cashier's check for $9,000. Every cent I'd managed to set aside since Patty died specifically for this moment. My graduation gift to my son. Start of life money. We ate. Speeches were made. Garrison stood and gave a toast that lasted 4 minutes and included the phrase, "The son I always wished I'd had," directed at Eli, who laughed and raised his glass. I drank my water. After dessert, when things were winding down and people were pushing back from the table, I leaned over and told Eli I had something for him. He looked at his phone first, a reflex, not intentional, I'm sure, and then set it face down and turned toward me. I handed him the envelope. He opened it without much ceremony, read the card, looked at the check, and then his expression did something I still think about. Not ungrateful exactly, more like recalibrating. The way someone looks when they receive a gift that's smaller than they expected, and they're trying not to show it. 9,000, he said. That's really thoughtful, Dad. Thoughtful. Like I'd brought him a fruit basket. I told him it was everything I had to spare, told him it was meant to give him a runway while he figured out his first job, first apartment. He nodded and put the envelope in his jacket pocket, and the conversation moved on to whether anyone wanted to share a taxi to the hotel bar. I drove home that night. 2-hour drive, mostly dark highway. I told myself I was making too much of things. Kids get caught up in big days. He was nervous about the speech. He forgot. It wasn't malice, I almost believed myself. The call came 3 weeks later. Eli, which surprised me because lately I'd been the one initiating. He sounded strange. Careful. He said Garrison had offered him a position, not at a dealership, in a commercial property development company. Garrison was launching with some partners. Equity stake from day one. He was going to take it. He was also moving in with Tessa, and they'd found a place in the short north area of Columbus. Things were moving fast, in the best way. That was all good news. I told him so. Then he said, "There's something else." He went quiet for a second. "Tessa and I have been talking. About the future, about what we want things to look like." I waited. "We want to be intentional about the people in our lives, Dad. Garrison has been. He's offered so much. Mentorship, connections, a real foundation. And I think going forward, the people in my daily life are going to be people in that world. People who can really," he searched for the word, "contribute to what we're building." I sat down. I was standing in my kitchen when the call started, and I sat down on the step stool I keep by the counter for reaching the high shelves. "I want to keep you in my life," he said quickly. "That's not what this is. I just think our relationship might look different. More." He paused again. "Intentional. More intentional." I asked him to say plainly what he meant. He said, "Garrison is going to be more present, day to day. He's already talking about being involved with kids, if Tessa and I go that direction. I think it just makes sense for him to be the main," he stopped, "the primary paternal figure. Going forward. Primary paternal figure." I was 63 years old, sitting on a kitchen step stool, being replaced by a car dealer from Dublin. I told Eli I understood. I kept my voice steady because Patty always said the worst thing you can do in a hard conversation is give the other person your collapse. I said I appreciated him being honest with me, and that I wished him every good thing and I would always be his father regardless of what anyone decided to call anything. He seemed relieved, said he knew I'd understand, said I'd always been easygoing. That was one of the things he appreciated about me. Easygoing. Good word for a man who'd refinanced his house so his son could study engineering. I hung up and sat in my kitchen for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a neighbor's dog was barking at something in the yard. I looked at the photograph on the windowsill. Eli, at maybe 8 years old, holding a fish he'd caught at Alum Creek, grinning that gap-toothed grin, holding the rod up with both hands, because it was still almost too big for him. I'd driven 45 minutes each way that morning, because he'd asked to go fishing, and I had a Saturday off, and that was reason enough. "Patty," I said out loud, "I don't know what I did wrong." The refrigerator kept humming. Nothing answered. I went to bed. In the morning I made coffee and looked out the kitchen window at the backyard, at the garden Patty had planted 20 years ago that I'd kept going, because letting it go felt like losing her twice. The tomatoes needed staking. The fence along the back was rotting at the post. I'd been meaning to fix that since the fall. I had a lot to do. I'd been putting things off for years because every spare hour went somewhere else. Into double shifts, into weekend warehouse work, into driving down to Columbus for visits that had gotten shorter and further apart. I started with the fence. I spent the next 3 weeks doing the maintenance on that house I'd deferred for years. Fixed the fence, staked the tomatoes, repainted the front porch, the original gray that Patty had picked out in 2003, cleaned out the gutters, sorted through the garage. It sounds like grief work, and maybe it was, but it was also something else. Each thing I fixed felt like reclaiming a square foot of my own life. I also thought. I thought a lot, in the particular way you can when your hands are busy and your head is quiet. I thought about the graduation speech, about how Eli had stood in front of 400 people and listed every influence in his life and decided his father didn't make the list. I thought about what that cost me to hear, sitting in row 22 with my good blazer and my new shoes and my sealed envelope. I thought about the phone call, about primary paternal figure, and I thought about a manila envelope in the top drawer of my desk, the one containing documents I'd never shown Eli, the one I'd carried around for 11 years, like a question I wasn't sure I'd ever need to ask. I'm not going to dramatize what it contains. It's simple enough. When Patty was sick, the last 8 months, when things were bad, she told me something she'd been keeping private. She made me promise to let her tell Eli herself. After she recovered, she didn't recover. And for years after, I told myself she'd been on a lot of medication, that she'd been frightened and not thinking clearly. But I had the documents, and I'd read them enough times to know what they said. Eli's college graduation announcement had run in the Columbus Dispatch. I don't know how Garrison came across it, but in the week after graduation I received a letter, hand-addressed, not printed, from a woman named Suzanne, who lives in Chillicothe, Ohio. It was 2 pages long. She explained who she was, which I already knew because Patty had told me. She said she understood if I didn't want contact. She said she'd seen the announcement and had only wanted to congratulate Eli from a distance. She left her phone number in case I ever felt the time was right. I held that letter for 6 days before I did anything with it. Then I wrote Eli a letter of my own. I wrote it by hand, 4 pages on the yellow legal pad I use for house lists. It took me 3 evenings because I kept stopping and going for walks and coming back and starting over. The final version was the plainest I could make it. I told him about his mother's last weeks, about the conversation we'd had, about the manila envelope, about Suzanne. I told him that Patty had wanted to be the one to explain, and that she'd run out of time, and that I'd made a mistake in staying quiet as long as I had. I told him that the reasons were complicated: grief, protection, uncertainty, but that they were my reasons and not his burden to carry. I told him he had a right to know who he came from. And I told him, at the end, that nothing in those 4 pages changed a single morning I'd gotten up before 5 to drive a truck so he could go to a school that made him proud. That nothing changed the fishing trip at Alum Creek. That the word father is a verb, not a noun, and I had been doing it every day since he was 3 weeks old. And I would not stop just because Garrison Webb had a bigger checkbook and a box suite at Wrigley. I sealed it in a plain envelope, drove to Columbus on a Tuesday. I knew from Tessa, who still texted me occasionally, small kind gestures, that they were coming back from a weekend trip that evening and would be at the Short North apartment. I parked on the street, walked up to the building, slid the envelope under the door, the way you do when you've said everything you need to say and you want it received quietly, without performance. I drove home. That was at 6:40 on a Tuesday evening in late July. By 9:15 my phone started ringing. I let the first call go, and the second. I wasn't ready for the version of that conversation that happens when someone is still in shock. Shock produces noise, and I wanted to have the conversation when we could both be still. The third call I answered. He didn't say anything for a moment. I could hear him breathing. Then he said, "Is it true?" I told him yes. He went quiet again, and then something changed in the quality of his silence. It was different from the silences I'd been living with. The polite distance, the managed calls, the careful language about intentionality and paternal figures. This was something raw underneath all of that. Something younger. He said, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I said what I'd said in the letter, that his mother had wanted to and hadn't had the time, and that I'd carried it wrong. He said, "She's in Chillicothe?" I said yes. I told him about Suzanne's letter, told him I could send him her contact information if he wanted it. That was entirely his choice, and I would support whatever he decided, and I would not weigh in on it one way or the other. He went quiet again. A long quiet. I sat in my kitchen and Columbus traffic sounds coming through the phone from wherever he was standing. Then he said something I didn't expect. He said, "I didn't put your name in the speech because I was afraid I'd cry. I didn't respond right away." He said, "I wrote about you in the first draft. I cut it because the one time I practiced saying your name out loud I had to stop. I didn't think I'd make it through." I looked out the window at the backyard. The tomatoes were doing well. The fence looked solid. I said, "You should have told me that." He said, "I should have told you a lot of things." We talked for 2 hours, not about everything. You can't do everything in one call when there are 30 years worth of things that got said sideways or not said at all. But we talked. He asked about his mother. He asked about the documents. He asked me what I remembered about the first year, when he was small, and I told him about the fishing, and the nights I walked him around the kitchen at 2 a.m., because nothing else would quiet him, and how Patty and I used to laugh about it afterward, how we'd say, "This kid is going to be stubborn about everything," and he'd said, "Well, he turned out to be right about that." He said, "I don't want Garrison to be. I don't want what I said on the phone. That was stupid. I was trying to be something I'm not." I told him people do that sometimes, especially when they're young, and someone is offering them a version of themselves that feels more impressive than the one they started with. He said, "You never made me feel like I wasn't enough." I said, "That's because you always were." That was 3 months ago. Things are different now, not fixed. You don't fix 30 years of drift in a summer, but different. He calls on Sundays. He drove up to Columbus twice in August, once to help me with the back garden. He's met with Suzanne. I know that much, though he hasn't told me the details and I haven't asked. That's his story to tell in his own time. Garrison is still in the picture. I've made my peace with that. The Webbs gave Eli things I couldn't, and I'm old enough not to hold that against anyone. But Eli calls me on Sundays, and he drove up to help with the garden, and when I answered the door the second time came, he didn't hug me quick and firm the way you hug an obligation. He hugged me like someone who had been carrying something heavy and was glad to put it down. That's enough. That's more than enough. I still have the photograph of him at Alum Creek. It's on the windowsill where it's always been, next to the aloe plant Patty started from a cutting in 1998. Both of them have had to be kept alive through some difficult seasons. Both of them are still here. I'm 63 years old. I've got a garden that needs tending and a fence I finally fixed, and a son who calls on Sundays. Patty would have said that's a life. She'd have been right.